and welcome to Always Take Notes.
A message from our sponsor, Arvon. Do you have a story in you? Or want to test the waters of writing poetry or non-fiction? Maybe you already write, and write well, but would like to try a new form or genre, pick up some new tricks.
Enter Arvon. Arvon run a yearly programme of in-person and online events, from 5-day residential writing weeks that take place at one of their 3 writing houses, to pay-what-you-can online events and online masterclasses that delve deep into craft over the course of 2 hours. Their courses cover everything from commercial, genre, and experimental fiction to poetry, screenwriting, and even songwriting.
They've been running creative writing courses up and down the UK since 1968. In that time, their prize-winning tutors, many of whom may be some of your favourite writers, have unlocked the creativity of over 100,000 people. Many have gone on to be published authors and career writers themselves.
But actually, it's not about that. Writing with Arvon is about finding a supportive community of fellow writers, making like-minded connections that last a lifetime. By signing up for a course, you don't just get an acclaimed author as your tutor, you also gain a writing group to bounce ideas off long after the course is finished.
So whether it's a cosy stay at one of their writing houses in Devon, West Yorkshire or sleepy Shropshire, or a course you can do from the comfort of your sofa, Arvon works around your creative life.
Visit arvon.org/courses, that's arvon.org/courses, to learn more and give yourself the gift of writing. Hello and welcome to Always Take Notes. In this episode, we speak with the novelist Adam Thirlwell.
We spoke to Adam about his stellar academic career and publishing his first novel in his early 20s, about balancing fiction with working for literary magazines, and about his latest novel, The Future Future.
It's a great episode. We hope you enjoy it. Welcome, Adam, to Always Take Notes. It's fantastic to have you on the show. Could we start with your latest novel, The Future Future? It's got a partly historical setting, but it's not exactly a historical novel. Could you tell listeners a little bit about it?
So this novel, The Future Future, which was a kind of comical title for a book that's ostensibly set in the past, is roughly set just sort of before and after the French Revolution. So it begins from a genuine, true historical situation, which was that in the years before the French Revolution, there were a group of very disaffected, unsuccessful hack writers who were French hack writers living in London and writing bitter pornographic pamphlets about the rich women back in Paris, which they then smuggled across the border. And these then became like huge bestsellers in France at the time. And I kind of discovered this scene, and that, I guess, was the beginning of the novel, that there was something about this idea of angry writers maligning this group of women, and on the one hand, it being a genuine political gesture, and on the other hand, it being just really horrible kind of malicious use of language that kind of interested me. But it's true that in many ways, this book is deliberately also written in such a way that you could almost read it as a 21st century novel as well.
And was there one text in particular? We came across this thing called Les Mémoires Secrètes d'une Femme Publique, aimed at Madame de Barry, the mistress of Louis XV. Was that a particular one, or were there a whole slew of them?
There were so many of them. So it's true that Madame du Barry was one of the most, she was one of the first to kind of get this kind of libelous treatment. But there were many always called like with weird, like they were called secret memoirs or like the private suppers of, and the kind of, there'd be lots of asterisks and ... and with basically more and more lurid accusations of what was going on. And so there's something I think very, in many ways quite sympathetic about them, because I think in some way you could certainly argue that they were part of a movement that clearly did lead to the revolution. And I think the interesting thing is that once something becomes sayable, then it becomes doable. And I think once these very remote kind of rich figures were able to be basically just utterly satirized in this deeply pornographic and crazy writing, it clearly did become possible for then people to think, well, hang on, these are just like, they no longer have the right to these kind of extraordinary privileges and this extraordinary wealth. So I think what's fascinating about it for me, I think, is that you can see it in both these ways, that they were radical writers in some way, but it's not obvious that that was really their motivation, in writing. It's not at all obvious that they saw themselves as genuine political writers.
I suppose that was particularly true of Marie Antoinette as well. You mentioned the 21st century sort of corollaries. Were there any sort of public shamings of women in particular that you had in mind that were recent, or as a sort of general mood?
Yeah, I think it was more the general mood. I think it wasn't that there was any one specific moment. I think it was this sense, though, that something that I think is, fascinating me was that I think it was the anonymity. Like there was the real link to me about kind of the writing on the internet, as it were, and the writing then was the impunity that anonymity gives you, and the sort of way in which it seems to allow people to access parts of their personality that they would never give rein to in any other kind of situation. So yeah, it was more just the general feeling that one of the main uses of the internet are these kind of Reddit scandals of like trying to shame women. But I don't think, there are so many, it feels like there was no need for one single inspiration.
And this decision of yours to use modern day language or terminology, so examples like freeway, fascist, punk, goofy, obviously the novel then takes kind of more surrealistic turns in due course, getting to the moon. But, what were you trying to do with that particular linguistic point?
Well, I think it was trying to do lots of different things. I mean, I think the most direct was, I've always been interested in translation. And one of the things that is really fascinating to me about translation of historical texts is that you have this dilemma in translation theory, basically, of if there's a text that came out in the 18th century, should you translate it trying to kind of keep close to 18th century language, which will inevitably in the 21st century seem very dated and archaic? Or do you translate it into much more modern day language, which will therefore in some way completely alter the original, but in the other way maybe give the kind of effect that was the effect that the text had at the moment when it was written? And I think there's a line like very early on in the novel about sort of everything happens in the present moment. And so the kind of reason was, it wasn't even so much to set up the corollaries between the past and the present. It was more to think, well, actually within the moment that this is describing, how do you kind of mimic the kind of contemporary urgency that they would have been feeling? And so the kind of way I found most interesting was to do it like that. And obviously then I think with often like when you're writing, like small decisions that you start off with you can think, oh, actually it's useful for this other reason too, and kind of so you start to exploit it. So I think as I was writing, I think I was so enjoying it that I kind of increased that technique because it was allowing me lots of other things apart from anything. Also a kind of comic effect as well, that there was something funny to me if you could describe, I don't know, like you take the real writer Beaumarchais, and basically the true story of Beaumarchais being that before he became this very famous playwright who wrote like The Marriage of Figaro, it took him a lot of time to get The Marriage of Figaro actually put on at the main kind of theatre in Paris, that they were constantly turning it down. Then the censorship bureau would get involved and say, no, it's not possible, and so I think in the novel I therefore describe him as being stuck in development, which is obviously a Hollywood term, but so in one sense completely inaccurate, and in the other an entirely accurate. It's exactly the state that he was stuck in, which was that there were a number of business concerns that were meaning that his script wasn't moving forward. And then I guess also there's a thing about historical fiction, basically, that it's this kind of, I feel, especially in Britain, maybe it's got a kind of tradition behind it. And there are some kind of extraordinary examples like Hilary Mantel of these these novels that take history very seriously and that see their duty as to really try and keep as close as possible to an idea of historical accuracy. And I think one of the things I was trying to play with was to see what you could do with a historical novel that just deliberately enjoyed anachronism, that didn't try and kind of hide from it, but would actually use it.
It's interesting because on television and in film, there's been a real movement towards that, playing with the past, and especially in terms of language, being a lot more playful and, not being constrained by fact. Was that something that you were influenced by, or was it separate to that?
Well, I think it's interesting because I think the first sort of one that comes to mind is like Sofia Coppola's Marie Antoinette. And I definitely had that in mind when I was first kind of sort of thinking about the project. And then it's true that actually it was almost, and then The Favourite came out probably when I was, this project's taken me quite a long time with other, by being interrupted by other things. And so I think probably by the time The Favourite was out, I was already into this kind of way of doing things. So, but I guess that was kind of useful as a way of thinking, okay, it clearly is possible to do. And then I think after that, The Great came out as well. So there has been this mini filmic TV tradition. I think it's a lot less common in the novel, which is quite interesting. I don't quite know why the conventions seem to hold more tightly in fiction, in written fiction, than they seem to in film.
Reading some of the criticism and commentary on the novel, there was various people were saying the way your career started with, say, politics and stuff, these were novels where sex and sexuality and sort of male sexuality were quite big themes. And that this novel is a sort of change that direction, that it's touching what some people have unkindly said, a kind of series of sort of contemporary touchstones. So women's rights, the colonialism, that kind of thing. And, the suggestion in some quarters that you're kind of trimming to a changed cultural environment. What would be, do you think that's fair in any way? And what would be your response to people who've said that?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I see them as much more continuous probably in their concern, because I feel like all my books have clearly had sex in some way as part of it, or desire, and kind of how desire is negotiated, and the relation of those things to a political idea, like how far you can generalize sort of ethical behavior from how we behave in our kind of most private life to how you kind of behave more generally, and kind of how much you can, how far you can include desire in kind of theories of how we should live. So I guess the sort of big switch here is simply that it's much more from a woman's perspective. But yeah, so I don't feel though that the angle has really changed. I think it's more that it's interesting because I did consider doing it much more from the perspective of some of these writers, and then basically got bored, that it felt like, to me, a much more obvious story, or like an old-fashioned story that would follow the life of one of these men. And I was much more interested in the experience of these women being written about, which I think actually weirdly, like, as well as obviously, I'm sure there was a kind of partly political kind of idea behind it, but I think also quite personal, which is I think I am quite fascinated by the state of being written about as much as writing. And I think it's actually a very strange kind of situation to have, to see yourself described like, you just have in the words of other people. And so I kind of wanted to explore that. So the reason therefore for that was much more kind of intimate to the novel than any kind of idea of, I don't think you could write a novel thinking, what are the 5 contemporary touchstones I need to, it would die on impact.
I saw in another interview you described your characters as people who've been sort of hobbled in their careers as libertines. So I guess this is a different perspective on that. Could we roll back to your early life now? You've said that your initial interest in writing sort of arrived when you were 12 and you realised that you could get your mother's attention by making her read one of your poems. Could you tell us a little bit more about your childhood interest in writing and literature?
Yeah, I guess, I don't think, I had a very sort of, it's true, I grew up in a very bookish family, with books everywhere. But I don't think I was very much a great reader or particularly interested until there was this sudden moment where I think I discovered poetry, basically. And it became a weird passion that I couldn't kind of quite understand, but I kind of needed to do. And yeah, it's true that maybe I would show these poems to my mother, and clearly I enjoyed that kind of total focus of attention in some horrifically Oedipal way. And so then I think for most of my adolescence, I actually was very sort of snobbish about novels. I think I very much thought, oh, poetry is the true thing, and like novels are just these, they must be super easy. And then probably, again, I've talked about this, like it was probably around 18 when I first read, I think some of Kundera's essays, Milan Kundera's essay, like The Art of the Novel. And one of the things that I think really excited me was because the way he was talking about novels was as if they were essentially as artful and exciting as poems. And I think that was the first time I'd really thought that, oh, okay, actually there could be a structure and a kind of feel for language that might be the same kind of thing that you might apply to a poem, you can apply to a novel. And suddenly novels seemed to me that, there was this whole world suddenly that I enjoyed exploring.
You then had this really stellar early academic career. So you came top in your year at Oxford, and you were then a fellow at All Souls. I was wondering, could you, maybe for people who aren't familiar with what that is, explain that process? And then also, what was it like at the time? And then what is it like 2 decades on, looking back on that experience of sort of being anointed, as it were?
Yeah, so I read English at Oxford, so I did my undergraduate degree there, which I kind of really did like. One of the things that's nice about that is that you just read anything you like. It's very, in many ways, in a bad way, very untheoretical. But the good thing about that is that it just means that you can basically roam around the history of English literature. And then when I left, all I knew was that I wanted to try and write. And kind of, so I was just, thinking, well, I'm just going to find somewhere that's going to let me do this. I need to kind of, with as little extra work as possible. And so All Souls is this basically postgraduate college that has this very strange mixture of incredibly august older philosophers and intellectuals, but also has this sort of scheme where they elect every year like 2 recent graduates. So you have to take an exam. And so it was a suddenly very strange experience that so I managed to get the fellowship there, which is for 7 years if you stay the whole length. And certainly that was in itself completely crazy, because you're suddenly in this extraordinary world of candlelit dinners and you're talking to world famous philosophers at dinner. And so I was incredibly lucky, because basically that gave me the time and the space to write what became my first novel, Politics. And my kind of bet to myself was that I'll try and do this for a couple of years, and then if this kind of implodes, then I can, this is a safe place where I can then maybe do academic work or kind of, pursue something else. But so I think that in many ways that was an extreme, I think certainly compared, to a lot of other writers, I had, that opportunity was quite amazing. And then it's true that then 2 years, then I got published, and then it kind of did very well. And I think that, it's interesting kind of, I definitely now think of myself as being very young. I was very young, but at the time I thought it was totally normal. You're 24 and your book is out and kind of everything's incredible. And it's interesting to me now to think actually how vulnerable I was and how kind of trained, as it were, I was in that experience and how strange it was.
Could we talk now then about Politics, your debut novel, which was obviously published when you were 24, 25. Where did the idea come from, and how long did it take you to write it once you'd had that idea? Yeah,
so that novel is basically about a sort of polyamorous, it's about a throuple. And I thought, it's interesting, I really can't remember. I mean, it's 20 years ago. I definitely remember thinking it was in no way autobiographical. And so there was something kind of, and I think I needed that safety. I was thinking, I'm going to choose this subject where it's fascinating to me, but actually this is not my life. And I remember my agent, when he first kind of took the manuscript, saying, you realize that every interview is going to ask you, why you didn't enjoy being in a threesome, and I think that, so the idea came to me, I think, just very gradually. Like all my books, actually, I never have some full idea of what to do. I think I start often with a situation or with a kind of dilemma or something that kind of sparks me. And then I kind of very laboriously work my way through. But it's true that actually that novel was probably the quickest of all my books. I think it took about 2 years. But then I guess at the time I had, nothing else to do. So I had more time at my disposal. But the idea was really, I think, I was just fascinated by this kind of, the idea that you could take this thing that was to some people this fantasy and then try and subject it to a very realistic psychological analysis and seeing everyone's little moves and dissatisfactions and sort of trying to be kind of kind to people, even though, I was very interested, I think, in points where your desire for somebody might have failed, but you feel that there's a kind of moral obligation to stay in that relationship or to at least kind of try and keep some kind of kindness going. And so I think that was really, it was almost something that specific that was what started the book.
We really like on the podcast to get into the mechanics of how people got books published, particularly their first book. So with Politics, how did you go about getting an agent, and what was the process of selling it like?
So with Politics, yeah, I was really lucky. So basically, a friend knew, so my agent is a guy called Peter Strauss. So he's now, still was at Rogers Coleridge and White, but he had just left Picador. So he used to be he'd been an editor at Picador, running Picador, and had literally like that month, just when I'd kind of decided I'd finished this book, had left Picador to become an agent. And so this friend of mine said, well, look, here's his email address. Like, he does, at the moment, he's got literally no clients. So I thought this is kind of probably quite a good moment. So I had definitely this, very blessed route into publishing, I think, because, I'd had the time to write. I sent this only to him. So I just sent, he was the only agent I sent the manuscript to. He read it and really loved it. And then we sent it only to Jonathan Cape, so that I had this kind of, I think Cape was kind of in my head, like the publisher I really wanted, that they were publishing a lot of the people that I was interested in. And so we decided to try just sending it to them. And then luckily for me, the editor there, who was then Dan Franklin, who's now retired, also loved it. So I had this kind of incredibly protected route in to getting the first book published.
Were you nervous in terms of writing about sex for your debut book? It's a subject that people often mock or sort of pay more attention to. Was it something that you ever felt worried about, or did you know that it was baked into the story and that you'd sort of deliver on it?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I think at the time, I think I did. I think it's like I was thinking, like, I was very innocent, I think, in many ways. I didn't, it's not like I was constantly reading literary press or, like I was, I think, probably quite kind of inward. And so in many ways now I look back on it, I think it was actually a very brave book, but in a sense it wasn't, because I don't think I was quite aware of it as such. And it was more only as people were I think this, I only became nervous of it as, agents and other editors were reading it, and I realized that their reaction was quite kind of intense, and I hadn't kind of quite figured that out, I think. And I think that's one of the things that you learn as a writer, is actually the effect. Well, actually, I was about to say the effect a book may have, but actually the other thing that fascinates me with writing is how unpredictable the effect a book has, so that you think you understand what this book is doing or how it's going to strike people. And then it can be quite surprising, I think, to you as the writer, the actual effect it has in the world. But it's true that certainly I think writing about sex is kind of, it's difficult. I don't know if there's also, the whole thing of like, there is a British attitude to writing about sex as if like it is somehow mockable or kind of, and I think in some ways I actually think I share that, in that there is a sort of lyrical writing about sex that I don't do, and that I think is what the British find most upsetting. And that kind of makes me sad, because I think there's obviously scope for that too. But I think that what's always fascinated me is this kind of the mixture of thinking and feeling. And so that was always the kind of aspect of sex that fascinated me, like the kind of moments when you can't stop thinking and can't just be in the moment. And so the bravery of it, I guess, is sometimes, there is always a bravery, I think, in any comic writing, and I guess especially about sex, because you don't have that veil of seriousness that means that, or it's kind of, since there is always this play with the autobiographical, I think, in all fiction, like there's no, like the way we read is just inherently interested in the idea that there must be some personal experience at the back of it. If you're writing about absolutely appallingly botched sexual encounters, then you know that everyone reading it is going to be thinking, aha, like, and this is interesting. And so there is a bravery there, I think, in having to risk the sort of possible identification. And I guess you just get used to it, and maybe almost you sort of encourage it, or you kind of play with it. And I think one of the reasons why, I think in my early books, there was also a lot of play with the narrator and how far the narrator was me or not me, or kind of, I think some of that did come from the fact that the books were so sexual, and that therefore there was maybe something almost protective, I think, about the way in which the books played with form as well.
We should say to listeners that Dan Franklin is also a past guest on Always Take Notes, so you can tune in directly to him. But I wanted to ask about the role of Craig Raine, both at the beginning of your career and then subsequently. So he was your tutor at university, but then you worked for him on Arete, this literary magazine, and it seems that he's a sort of been a significant person for a number of writers we had and publishing people. So we had David Shelley, who runs Hachette, who was also taught by him. But what was the part that he played? And maybe you could explain a bit about him for listeners who aren't familiar with him.
Craig he's a poet, and he was also, I think he's retired now. He was teaching at Oxford. He taught English at Oxford. And before that, he'd been poetry editor at Faber, where I think he was kind of notorious for hardly publishing any new poets. And he's also a very, divisive figure to many people, because I think when he was younger would write incredibly aggressive criticism. So I think, and he was part of a kind of group of writers, a very male group of writers with like Ian McEwan, Martin Amis, James Fenton, that were the sort of a similar generation. And I think for me, like the influence was actually probably from the teaching, was that one of the things I did enjoy by being taught by him, it could be infuriating in many ways, was the attention to detail. Like one of the things, it's there in his poetry as well, that he's in a sort of absolutely got a minute kind of way of reading texts, which sometimes we would tussle over, because I think I have a much more abstract and slightly sort of theoretical kind of way of thinking, whereas he was always very much just about the precise words and the minute detail, which I think definitely did have an influence, probably certainly on the first novel, on politics, which I think is very much a novel of very small details and sort of seeing how those fit together. It's kind of interesting, I think your influences can be very... So he was definitely a huge influence there. And then it's true that we worked together. I think I was there for like 2 years, helping him. I was his assistant editor at Arete. And that also, I think, was a huge education, was watching him edit. So, he was brilliant at taking a text from a very kind of august writer and then massively changing it. And I think actually one of the things I properly learned at Arete, at this magazine, was actually seeing how like writers that I thought would, not let a word be touched, were actually very happy to be kind of quite savagely often edited. And actually there was I started to think that the better the writer, the more open they were to editing, which is definitely something I think I've taken, that I'm always wanting to be edited, at every stage, and I'm very interested in any kind of feedback, whether that's an article or a novel. And so I think a respect for editing was something that he really showed me, not that he as it were taught that as some, but I think just by watching the process at the magazine. And it certainly left me with a definite nostalgic fondness for that world of magazines, basically, that I think that, the magazines that then came after, like the White Review or M+1, I've always enjoyed, because I think they're a crucial part of how literature gets made. I think they're a crucial kind of interface between the person on their own in a room and then the publishing house.
To remain on editing briefly, I read the tribute you wrote to Bob Silvers, the late editor of the New York Review of Books. In what ways did his editing approach differ, and what did you learn about editing that was sort of complementary or different to what you learned at Arete?
Yeah, so Bob was wonderful. He was also, this legendary figure editing the New York Review since it was founded. One of the founders of it. And there, I think the things I learned from Bob were a total, what was extraordinary with him was his total dedication. So he seemed to never have a day off. He would phone you on literally New Year's Eve, or you'd get an email from him, late on New Year's Eve, commenting on, a mistake he'd just noticed in a piece. And I think that one thing that I loved about Bob, I think I mentioned it in that thing, was the breadth of his sort of, not just erudition, which was extraordinary, but more just of his attention, that he would be as interested in Steven Soderbergh's latest movie as he was about the memoirs of Madame du Deffand or something, that he could really... And I think that lesson of total curiosity is something that I really loved in him. He was an absolute, in many ways, terrifying. And I remember the first piece he ever asked me to write about was to review, there was a new edition of Nabokov's poetry. And so I kind of sent in my first draft. Then I happened to be in New York. So we had a meeting where I came into the offices, and I'd been talking about, especially lots of the arguments Nabokov had about translation with Robert Lowell or with Joseph Brodsky, these kind of incredibly famous, or Susan, like these famous writers. And then I suddenly realized that he was referring to everyone by their first name. And it was because he'd just known them. And so it was this absolutely terrifying kind of idea that actually like 20th century literature was in his head, like he'd met it. The other thing that I loved about him was actually, I think, and it's quite similar, I think, to other editors I've liked, like Craig, which was constantly going for clarity. That I think that there's a way in which when you're writing, like one of the main, it's not quite an enemy, but like the temptation is to leave, a sentence doesn't quite say what you wanted to say, or it might be obvious to you what you're trying to make out, but to the reader who's, they're not going to be able to work out what this means. Or sometimes even that there might be actually a slight lack of courage, that there might be one more stage you need to make in the argument, which is potentially kind of going to upset some people, or it's going to not be the thing that's going to make you the most likable person in the room. And I think that Bob was amazing for always just sort of pointing you to the kind of moments where that was true, where he'd just say, I think here, this isn't clear, or, you haven't kind of gone far enough here. So unusually, I think for an editor, actually, Bob was much more expansive than reductive. That I think the cliche of the editor is that they're slashing through everything with a red crayon. And actually, Bob would often be encouraging you to write more, I think, on the basis that if you rushed a point, you would risk losing the reader. So I think that's definitely that obsession with clarity and with going to the end of your thinking is really the thing that I think I most loved working with Bob for.
We are thrilled to announce the publication of Always Take Notes, Advice from Some of the World's Greatest Writers. The book, edited by the two of us, features contributions from almost 100 past guests on the podcast. It's a distillation of the wit and wisdom we've heard over the past 6 years.
The book offers, we think, frank and entertaining guidance on writing in particular and living a creative life in general. It answers questions such as, where do the best ideas come from? How do you stay motivated? What does it take to become a published author? And how do you actually make money from your writing?
Published by Ithaca Press, Always Take Notes, Advice from Some of the World's Greatest Writers is available now in all good bookshops. We hope you enjoy reading it.
Could you talk us through the decade or dozen years kind of post-politics? So, that your subsequent projects, Miss Herbert, onto Lurid and Cute and stuff. How did your life evolve? Because, you're still a pretty young person at that point, and how did these next things you were working on come to pass?
Yeah, well, I think essentially, so it's true that the next book I published was actually a book of literary criticism, which is about basically the novel and translation. And I think one reason for that was that I think I got basically terrified. Like I'd had this huge kind of thing with my first novel, and I felt very much, I don't know, like I needed to get my bearings, as it were. Like I'd been sort of traveling a lot to, this book had been translated into many languages, and I think I didn't quite know what to do next, as it were. So and I think it was this mixture of talking about this book in many different languages and also feeling a little bit adrift that meant that I wrote this kind of book of essays, basically, instead of another novel. And I think I was kind of trying to, again, put a little almost protection around myself, almost, just to think, okay, I need to sort of take a moment. And it's true, because I was so young and I was, living in London. I'd already, met my girlfriend, now my wife, and she's an international lawyer, so she was very much based here. And so I think it was kind of, in many ways, actually, it was quite strange, because I think I sort of therefore grew up quicker than a lot of my friends, that there was a way in which suddenly everyone else was still kind of training to be a doctor or doing whatever, and I'd suddenly kind of got this, I was having to kind of be more adult than I think I felt I actually was. And I was being asked to kind of, it's always strange, I think, when you're being asked to kind of represent the views of a generation or anything, and you're thinking, I haven't got a clue, but in some way I will try and, give this interview. So I wrote that book of essays, and then wrote another novel, The Escape, which is my second novel, that came out quite soon afterwards. And again, I think in this effort to slightly sort of not repeat myself, and also try and not sort of, I think, seem like all I was going to do was write about young people having sex. I kind of deliberately chose like a very old protagonist. And then a few years later wrote Lurid and Cute. And I think that the other thing that has always interested me has actually been doing sort of other smaller projects in between. So as well as Lurid and Cute, I was also doing this project with McSweeney's magazine, which was a kind of collection of translations. And I think that I've often felt as soon as I finish one big project, like a novel, that I then need to sort of move to something else, like slightly adjacent to it or kind of an angle to it, to kind of, I don't know, try and think differently.
How did this sort of wider literary world respond to those different projects? We have also interviewed Monica Ali, who was also a Granta Best of Young British Novelists with her debut as well. And she said that people sort of expected her to do more of the same, more Brick Lane, Brick Lane Revisited, etc. And people were then sort of horrified when she didn't, when she went in a different direction. Did you find that your sort of post-politics works were accepted, or were people sort of expecting more of the same, more of young people having sex?
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly, I remember Dan probably being a little bit surprised when I came up to him with this book of essays, and then with this novel that was very much not about kind of the problems of young people in London in 2009, wherever it was. I think that, you know, there's a kind of way, it's true that I think that there's an idea that you should kind of keep doing the same thing. And I think often almost the desire of writers is different to the desire of, you know, readers. You know, that often as a reader, you're thinking, well, that was fantastic, this thing that you've done, and so now I would like that again. Whereas just it coincides with the writer thinking, well, I don't want to keep repeating myself kind of over and over. And so I think there is a sort of hard kind of negotiation, but also what interests me is often how I feel often, like we were saying actually with the Future, that it can look very different in some ways to the previous books. And then actually when I think about them, I can see all of these quite deep structural similarities. And like the same seems to be true all through the kind of the 4 novels I've written, that for all their seeming differences in time and space and protagonist, I think the deep kind of concerns are often the same. But it's true that, you know, people, and I've often had, I mean, to be honest, you know, I've had that even with politics. Like I'd say the reaction to my book seems to be always very strong and very polarized. So no one seems to have a kind of mild reaction. They either really like it or really hate it. And so I'm not sure that's really anything to do with shifting subject matter or not. That just seems to be somehow utterly innocently created by how I write.
How do you feel about that?
What, the polarized reactions?
Yeah.
I think when I was younger, I think I was deeply, deeply wounded by it, actually, in the sense that I found that not so much by, I think I felt very exposed and quite taken aback by how much of a personal image people could make of you when they'd never met you and, you know, knew nothing about you. And I think that there is a trauma to it, definitely. There's a strain, you know, it's very strange. And also the kind of, the fact that you can't really talk back, you know, you'd look absolutely insane if you then wrote a kind of weeping kind of riposte to someone's kind of, and I think that deep down, I guess you just have to think, you know, I think there's often a very big difference between your rational mind and how you feel, you know, so that rationally you can think, I know what I think of this book. Also, in many ways, you know, I think often it is true that, you know, I'm not saying it's true of my books, but often some of the best books are very divisive, you know, that they are not going to just create very consensual kind of agreement. So there's a way in which you can console yourself. And also, I think I've been lucky that, you know, often predominantly it's better than worse. It's also quite interesting watching watching books play out in different languages as well, in different, you know, cultures, so that I think that helps give a kind of different perspective where it, you know, it's not always as polarized in different kind of countries.
Do you think envy was part of it? I mean, you were very young, you know, that people were just bitter, or? I don't really want to speak on behalf of someone who may have quite genuinely hated a book. I think definitely
it's obviously true that when we're reading, like you can't kind of, and especially more and more nowadays, I think that there's a way of describing writers and discussing books that is in such a biographical context, or, so that it's all often, and there were crazy rumors about, like, utterly untrue rumors with my first book as to how much money had been given, or depending on, and it's true that, I can, any essay comes from the specific place you're in, and therefore you're going to react to a text, in a very personal way. And I think that the way I write does almost, it's not in any way antagonistic, I think, but it certainly is very personal. And so it's trying to play very much with the distance or not between a book and the reader. So whether it's envy, I don't think I can say that. I think that would be too easy to just say it's just that. But I do think that there is a culture of how we talk about books that seems to me sometimes quite kind of mad. I mean, the other thing that's also true is that often when you're reading someone else's, when you're reading someone attacking a book, it often seems much less terrible when it's someone else's book. And so kind of, I don't know how to answer it, in the sense that, but clearly it's not nice either when you feel like you certainly weren't trying to enrage.
I saw a quote from you where you said that in terms of your fiction, the dream is of this entirely impolite object, a gruesome and difficult toy. So I wondered to what extent it was inevitable, because obviously a gruesome and difficult toy is not something that everyone wants to play with.
Yeah, and I wonder how far, like you say all these things. No, and it's true. And I think that is one ideal for me of a work of art. There's no doubt that, like, I think some of the greatest works of art are gruesome and difficult toys. However, did I invent that theory because people were saying I'd invented gruesome and difficult toys? I don't know. Yeah, no, obviously it's true. I think that one of the things that I think was true of my writing earlier on, which I'm not sure is as true now, but was, I think they're both very sincere and very playful at the same time. And I think that that's kind of what I was meaning by these impolite toys, that they're kind of, so sort of that they will say things that, because it seems to me that one of the most beautiful things that fiction can do is allow you a space to speak freely, that kind of, they are asocial in some ways, unlike a conversation between two real people where you observe proprieties and kind of, limits on information you'll give out. There's something very beautiful about writing, I think, where it is a space to say what might seem unsayable or unacceptable. And I think that is true. So I agree that I think that's why I think I never really, I'm not complaining. If someone has a violently antagonistic reaction, clearly in some way it is provoked by the book, possibly by its almost very sincere innocence, as it were. So that I think, I mean, it's true. I remember reading a Philip Roth interview once where he said, I'm never thinking of an ideal reader, but I am thinking of the anti-Roth reader. And, the moment I'm excited when I'm writing it is thinking that reader is really going to hate it. And I don't think I've always loved that ideal, but personally, that's not how I write, that I think I'm not trying to provoke in that way.
You've mentioned as well some of the sort of lies or deceptions surrounding the advance or the money that you got for politics. And it's a rule of the show that we always ask about money. So how has sort of the financial side of your writing life worked, both sort of at the beginning and now? How is it divided between novel writing and other forms of journalism and other projects? Yeah,
it's a really interesting question. I think it's got more complicated, like, actually one of the things that I think I only now at 45 think about is thinking, wow, I was so mad at 20, like, I didn't think of this as a career, actually. I don't think I was, thinking, well, how is this going to keep working? And I certainly wasn't thinking strategically, as it were, in any kind of financial way. So what's definitely true, so certainly, like, politics did do very well and in a number of different languages. So that gave me a platform to believe I could totally just live off writing forever. Was my idea that was going to be totally fine. And then I think as you get older, you think, oh, okay, and this is not going to, it's not always going to be that easy. And so now, and I think, I guess it's divided between the novels are still definitely the main money. But the other interesting thing is, I guess, it's also about how long you take to write each book. So basically, the amount of money you get may, it, depending on how long it's taken you to create that book, you've been paid radically less per hour, as it were, if you wrote the same novel in a year than if you wrote it in 8 years. So I've always done essay writing as well, yeah, for especially the New York Review of Books, the London Review of Books, partly as almost like trying to get a salary, as it were, to think that there'll always be this relatively regular amount of money that's not gigantic in any way, but like that I know that I can kind of produce quickly, or more quickly than I seem to be able to produce a novel, because I've always been very slow, I think, at novels. And then I guess with Lurid and Cute, because that got optioned by a Hollywood producer, and there was a script where I co-wrote the script for that, which then never got made. But I've since done a little bit of script writing as well, as another way of kind of getting another sort of bits and pieces of money. So yeah, so I think that I'm much more aware now of the possibility of like terror that I think when I was 25, I kind of was much more idealistic and just thought that this would be fine forever. And I think that as I've got older, it's partly that you see other writers stop or get dropped by their publishers, or you're suddenly aware that, this is not necessarily a job for life. So I think that while I'm, that those questions are much more, I guess, in my mind, yeah, as to how to put it together. But I'd say now it's a kind of mixture of fiction, essay writing, and scripts.
The other question that we always ask novelists is how they go about constructing their books, and whether they are in the vernacular we've kind of appropriated, a plotter or a plunger, although some people say pantser for the second one. So is this whether you're someone who has worked everything out in advance, be that in post-it notes, we've even heard of a spreadsheet, or whether you are someone who just dives in and follows, and then obviously every permutation and middle ground between those. What is your method and your process, and has it evolved and changed over the novels that you've written?
I think probably just the simulacra of actual planning. I'm not sure they're very useful, but I'm very much always wanting to sketch out little kind of diagrams of characters and kind of plot points. But I'm certainly not someone who has the whole thing worked out the way through. That I think that, like I said, I can begin with something that seems to me quite interesting. I tend to then kind of go into that for a bit, then get nervous, sort of reread it, think, how is this actually working? And so I'd say that I'm kind of constantly like moving through a thicket of doodling and kind of planning that comes back. So I think at each stage I kind of make a new plan, thinking that I now know roughly where I'm going, and then that plan will get abandoned because I'll have gone on into some other kind of place, or kind of decided that there's another layer I want to add to the novel, and so now I'll have to kind of go back and start again. So like with Future, for instance, the actual literal beginning of that novel was a kind of crazy thing that I wrote, where I can't quite remember even why, but where I kind of did this dialogue between me and the sun, where the sun was telling me off and telling me that I needed to kind of change the way I was writing, and I was finding it really fun to write this kind of mad dialogue between them. Is
this the sun, the newspaper, or the sun, the celestial body?
That would be amazing. No, the sun, the cosmic sun. Maybe it should have been the Sun newspaper. And so I wrote this like 2 or 3 page dialogue between me and the sun, which I think has now survived in about 3 sentences, of where you refer to some of this surreal aspect of the future. Some of this kind of alien talk in the future, I think, was in this initial dialogue. But I remember writing, phoning up my editor saying, I'm so excited, this is how the novel should begin, is with me kind of and she was just like, please do not open a novel with you talking to the sun. This is not happening. But what I find interesting is that almost entirely got jettisoned, obviously, but it enabled me into something that ended up at that novel. So I think that I've come to trust, I guess, this way of writing, even though actually I think emotionally it makes me very anguished, and I wish I was someone who had a much clearer idea before I started. And I always have this dream that the next project will happen and I will exactly know what I'm doing. And instead it always happens that I sort of enter into this, I don't know, just this mess that I somehow find my way out of.
I don't know if that's the note that we should end on, but we have come towards the end of our time. Wishing you the very best with the future and all your projects going forward.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
That was the Always Take Notes interview with Adam Thirlwell. His website is adamthirlwell.com, and The Future is published by Jonathan Cape. Hello, it's us again. Rachel, what was your takeaway from the interview with Adam?
I think we covered a lot of ground in that interview, actually, from what it's like to break out at a young age, which I know we've discussed with other novelists as well, but as well as the importance of particular editors or collaborators, and then enlighten it what it's like writing about sex. I thought Adam was honest and humorous throughout, and I really enjoyed the conversation. How about you?
Yeah, I think similar. I think what was very interesting is to talk about that experience of very early success from a perspective of, I suppose it's coming up to 2 decades later. So I think he was, gracious about it, and also able to kind of look back on that experience of actually what it's like having a widely talked about novel come out while you're in your 20s with a perspective that might be difficult to appreciate when you're in the moment. So I thought kind of great to have him there, and you know, to hear him sort of look back on all that. And I also thought, that, you know, for someone who had early success, he was also kind of gracious and humble, which is not always the way. So it was great to add him to our roster. Rachel, what have you been up to?
So I'm now back to reality after 3 weeks of weddings and travel and general merriment. So I'm excited to get back into work, really, and start some writing projects. So
would you like to tell the listeners about the koala?
Well, I was in Australia over Christmas, and Simon had requested pictures of the local flora and fauna. So of course I obliged with a picture of a koala. The wallaby was actually my favourite, but you know,
I definitely prefer the koala, but yeah. They
were both very sweet. And so got some reading done and watched lots of TV on the very, very, very long flight. So yes, it was lovely. It feels a very long time ago now, but it was great. And in terms of things I've been watching, I was catching up on Maid, actually, which was released on Netflix, I think a couple of years ago, but it's excellent. So I'd recommend it to anyone who is looking for a show. It's not particularly uplifting. In fact, it's not uplifting at all. It's about a young mother trying to navigate the welfare system in the US, but it's very well acted. So yeah. And how about you, Simon? What have you been up to, and what have you been consuming?
I'm back in France for my ebook project, doing this course with people who want to be French mountain guides, which is fascinating, but also extremely demanding and at times quite frightening. But that's going well. In terms of reading, I'm reading a French book from the 1970s about a extreme skier called Sylvain Saudin. It's called Le Skieur de l'Impossible, the skier of the impossible, which is sort of fascinating and actually very gripping. I haven't watched any TV at all because I haven't got access to one at the moment, but I've been listening to a few German podcasts to keep things ticking over. Anyway, this has been Always Take Notes, hosted by me, Simon Acomb.
And me, Rachel Lloyd.
Our producer and social media editor is Artemis Irvin, our score is by Jess Danheiser, and our graphic design is by James Edgar.
If you'd like to follow us on social media, we're on Instagram at Always Take Notes. We're on Twitter at Take Notes Always. If you'd like to support us on our crowdfunding page on Patreon, we're on there under Always Take Notes. And if you'd like to leave a review on iTunes or get in touch with us via our website, please do.
Many thanks. Goodbye.